Chill. There's a kind of quiet music that only Wyoming knows. Not silence, never silence. The wind still moves through the tall grass. The music horses still shift in the corral. Somewhere far off, chill, a meadowlark music calls once and doesn't call again. But beneath all of it, beneath the creak of the fence post and the distant roll of thunder building slow over the mountains, there's a stillness, chill, a peace so deep it settles in the chest like warm bread after a long day's ride. Caleb Morrow had lived on that land for 25 years and never once questioned it. He fixed fences because fences needed fixing, chill. He rose before the sun because the cattle didn't wait. He ate alone at a table built for four because the house had been quiet since his father passed. Quiet in ways that wind and open sky couldn't fill. Chill. He wasn't a lonely man. He told himself that often enough that he almost believed it. And then on the third Tuesday of June, in the year 1883, a woman drove a wagon down his road, got one wheel stuck clean in the mud, chill, stepped down without a word of complaint and started pulling fence boards out of the back like she'd been doing it all her life. Her name was Nora Quinlan. Guard-eye. She was 40 years old, composed as still water, chill, and entirely unimpressed by him. Caleb Morrow didn't stand a chance. She didn't ask for help. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. Not her copper hair threaded with silver catching the afternoon sun. Not the calm set of her jaw, chill. Not the way her blue dress was already dusted at the hem from the muddy road. What he noticed first was that she didn't call out, didn't wave her arms, didn't do any of the things people when they want someone to come running. Chill. She just worked. He'd been replacing a post on the north fence line when the wagon appeared at the bend in Music the Road. He watched it slow, watched the right front wheel sink into the rut left by last week's rain, chill, watched the whole rig tilt sideways with a groan of wood and iron. She climbed down from the seat with the careful movements of someone who had learned long ago not to trust unstable ground, chill, walked around to the back, pulled the canvas aside, and started unloading fence boards one at a time, setting them in a neat stack on the dry grass beside the road. Caleb walked over. "Ma'am, chill?" She looked up without startling, eyes the color of creek water in shadow, green steady, giving nothing away. She took in his age in a single glance, and something in her expression closed, just slightly, chill, like a door eased shut rather than slammed. "Morning," she said, though it was well past noon. She looked at the sun, music calculated quietly, and gave a small nod. "Afternoon, then, chill." He crouched beside the wheel and pressed his hand into the mud around the axle. Deep but not hopeless. He got his shoulder behind the wagon frame. She took the reins without being told, climbed back up, chill, clicked her tongue at the horse, jai, and waited. It took 2 tries. On the second, the wheel broke free with a sucking pull, and the wagon rolled forward onto solid ground. She looked back at him, chill, mud on his sleeve, breath steady. "Thank you," she said. "Where are you headed?" "Ridgecrest. Music. I'm the new school teacher." He nodded once. "Road forks a mile ahead. Take the left." "Chill." She studied him a moment longer, then was strictly polite. Then she climbed down and began loading the fence boards back into the wagon. He picked up the other end without asking. "Before we ride any further with Caleb and Nora, chill, if this story is settling in nice and easy, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave us a like. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. Now, chill, let's see if that school teacher makes it to Ridgecrest without looking back." She did look back, once, just before the road bent around the stand of cottonwoods, and the wagon would have disappeared from view entirely. Chill. She turned her head, not her whole body, just her head, and Caleb was still standing there at the fence line, hammer back in hand, already working. He didn't wave. Neither did she. Nora faced forward and kept the horse moving. Chill. A young man being decent on a country road, that was all. Wyoming was full of decent young men, boys really, most of them. She had coats older than 25. She almost smiled at that. Almost, chill. Ridgecrest was smaller than the agency letter had suggested. One main street, a general store, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and a schoolhouse at the east end of town that needed paint badly and a new door latch worse. Her landlady, a widow named Mrs. Holt, took one look at her traveling bag and said, "You've moved before, Rachel?" "Several times," Nora said. "You running towards something or away?" "Neither. I go where the work is." Mrs. Holt left Musk a pitcher of water and a square of cornbread on the dresser and closed the door softly behind her. "Rachel?" Nora sat on the edge of the bed. Outside the window, the Wyoming evening was settling in, purple music and gold over the mountains, the first stars already faint above the ridgeline. A dog barked somewhere down the street. "Rachel?" A screen door banged. Someone was cooking something with onions. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a town going about its life without her. She had arrived in 11 towns this way, always the stranger, Rachel? Always the schoolteacher, always the woman who was competent and reliable and who no one thought to invite to supper, because surely she had her own arrangements. She ate the cornbread alone. It was good cornbread, Rachel. She didn't let herself think about the man at the fence. She only half succeeded. Rachel? He came to town 4 days later with a paper sack of nails he genuinely needed and a route through the main street that was genuinely out of his way. Rachel? He was coming out of the hardware store when he nearly walked into her outside the general store, standing on the boardwalk with a list in one hand and a look of mild annoyance directed at a barrel of flour that was not the weight she'd been promised. Rachel? She was telling the store clerk, a boy of 17 who was clearly not accustomed to being corrected in that particular tone of voice. "Yes, ma'am," the boy said, and went back inside. Rachel? She turned and found Caleb 2 feet away. Surprise first, then composure settling over her features like a curtain draw name across end window. "Morrow. Morrow. Caleb Morrow. Miss Quinlan." She paused. "Rachel?" Though you likely heard word travels, a faint smile, brief as a cloud shadow crossing open grass, hardware music store, nails, the fence. He blinked. He hadn't expected her to remember. "Same one," he said. "Rachel? Is it giving you trouble?" "Post-rot. It's just the nature of things." She seemed to consider that. "I suppose it is." The flower boy returned with a corrected ticket. Nora checked it, signed, "Rachel?" Turned back to Caleb as if she'd been aware of him the entire time, which he suspected she had. "Good afternoon, Mr. Morrow. Miss Quinlan." She walked away at an even, unhurried pace. "Rachel?" He stood on the boardwalk a moment longer than necessary. He needed more nails next week too, he decided. October came in cold and golden and found Caleb Morrow standing in his barn at dusk, talking to his horse. Rachel? This was not new. He'd been talking to horses since before he could properly talk to people. But the subject had shifted. She looked out the window again, he told the mare, who was eating and thus willing to listen. Friday 8. Rachel? 30 same as last week. "I know how it looks," he said. "I know what the town thinks. Holt woman's already got opinions." He leaned against the stall post, arms crossed, looking at nothing in particular. "Rachel? Doesn't change what I see when I'm around her. Doesn't change that she's the most honest person I've met in this county. Doesn't change that she laughed last Tuesday music, and I've been thinking about it since." "Rachel?" The mare shifted. "She's 40 years old," Caleb said, quiet wait. "And I'm 25. And I know that, I'm not a fool." He was quiet for a moment. "But I've run this ranch since I was 19. Rachel? I've made decisions most men twice my age haven't had to make. I buried my father without falling apart, and I kept the cattle through 2 bad winters, and I've never asked a single person for something I couldn't justify. Rachel?" He pushed off the post and picked up the feed bucket. "So I'm asking myself one question. Not what the town thinks, not what she thinks right now, because right now she's still deciding." He set the bucket down. "Rachel, the question is whether she's worth waiting for." He looked at the mare. "She is," he said. "That's the whole of it." He went back to the house, ate alone at the table built for 4. Rachel? And for the first time since his father passed, he looked at the empty chairs without the familiar heaviness. Not always. Not Yugi, he allowed himself, that much. One thought. Not always. Then he washed his plate, banked the fire, and went to bed, because the cattle still needed tending at dawn, and patience had never once meant standing still. She told herself she wasn't watching the road. She knew the sound of his wagon now, the particular creak of it, the rhythm of the horse, and when it passed the schoolhouse on Friday afternoon at 8:30, she set down her chalk and music looked out the window. He wasn't stopping. Good, she thought. That was good. She was not a woman who entertained foolishness. She had done that once in Ohio music at 28 with a man who had broad shoulders and a quick smile and absolutely no intention of staying. She had believed things she shouldn't have believed and learned the lesson plainly. Self-sufficiency was not a consolation prize. It was armor, and armor kept you standing. She turned back to the blackboard. She was 40 years old. She had a teaching certificate and 11 towns behind her and a life that was perfectly manageable. The town was quiet. Mrs. Holt's cornbread was excellent. That was enough. On Sunday the church held a potluck. Nora brought molasses cake because it was expected, and meeting expectations in a new town was simply efficient. He was there near the fence at the edge of the churchyard. Slightly apart from the ranchers talking cattle prices, tin plate in hand, looking like a man entirely comfortable in his own company. He saw her across the yard. One nod, the same nod he'd given on the road. Your existence is a fact I have accepted and intend to continue accepting. She nodded back. Mrs. Holt appeared at her elbow with the energy of a woman who found silence deeply suspicious. You know Caleb Morrow? We've met. Good boy. Steady. Runs that ranch alone since his father passed. A meaningful pause. Very, Nora said. Mrs. Holt smiled and said nothing else, which was somehow worse. Nora ate her cake and did not look across the yard again. She looked twice. He asked her to walk. No moonlight, music, no borrowed courage. A Sunday afternoon with a blue sky and a prairie wind and half the town 20 yards away eating pie, and he simply came to stand beside her near the cottonwood and said quietly, "Would you want to walk a little?" There's a good view of the valley from the north ridge. She looked at him. He looked back. No expectation, no performance, just a question. People will notice, she said. Probably. She considered the pie on her plate, the 15-minute walk, Mrs. Holt's music face. All right, she said. They walked. He didn't talk much, which she appreciated. He pointed out a hawk riding the thermals above the ridge. Tilted his head upward and said, "Red-tailed, nesting up there since I was a boy." She watched it circle. "You grew up here," she said. "Born in that ranch house, never really left. Does that bother you?" He thought about it honestly. No, God, some people need to go looking. I always figured what I needed was right here, and I just had to tend it music right. Below them, the valley stretched in every shade of gold and green, the river catching light in the middle distance, the town small and settled at the far edge. "It's beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said. She glanced sideways and found him looking at her, not the valley. "Caleb." "Mr. Morrow," she said firmly but without cruelty. "I am 40 years old, I know that. You are 25. I know that too." "Gah, then you understand why this walk is simply a walk." "Gah, yes ma'am," he said. A beat of silence. "Gah, but it's a good walk," he added. She looked straight ahead at the valley and the mountains and the hawk still turning slow circles in the high October air. She did not smile. She almost did not smile. He brought her apples. A basket of them left on the schoolhouse steps on a Monday morning before she arrived. No note, just the basket, the apples, and the early morning light on October wood. She stood music there, looking at them for a long moment. Then she carried them inside and set them on her desk. And when Billy Alcott came in and said, "Miss Quinlan, where'd you get all them apples?" she said, A neighbor was music generous, and she kept 2 apples and returned the basket to his ranch on Saturday. It was proper. You return a borrowed basket. That was manners, not intention. The ranch was well kept, guard fences recently mended, barn solid, house with real glass in the windows. He came out wiping his hands on a cloth, and when he saw her, he went still for just a moment. Chill? The way he sometimes did, like a man making sure of what he was seeing before he committed to a response. I brought pie, she said. You can't return a kindness with an empty pan. Come in. I'll put coffee on. Chill? She hesitated on the wagon seat. This was the moment. She knew it with the same clarity she'd known things she'd learned the hard way. Walk inside Gar and something between them would stop being deniable. Chill. Not because anything improper would happen, but because sitting across a table from someone and sharing something you musingly made with your hands, that was a choice. That meant something. She climbed down. Chill? I can only stay an hour, she said. That's plenty, he said. He held the door. She walked through it. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and coffee and something that felt, against all her better judgment, chill, like a room that had been waiting for someone to use it properly. They stayed 2 music hours. She didn't notice until the light changed, the kitchen going from gold to amber. She looked up from the empty pie plate, chill, the cold coffee, the conversation that had moved from students' music to whether to his father's land to her years of moving and never quite arriving anywhere. 2 hours. She looked at her hands. I should go. I know, he said. Chill? Neither of them moved for a moment. Caleb, his namesake said plainly. He registered it. A small stillness, quickly recovered. What is it you think this is? 2 people who are good in each other's company. That's all? Chill? That's not nothing, he said quietly. In my experience, that's the thing most people never music find. She looked at him across the table. This broad-shouldered, chill, dark-eyed young man who had never once said an untruth. Come to supper, mused, finally. I'll cook this time. He looked at her steadily. Yes, ma'am. She drove home in the early dark. Chill. The Wyoming quiet wrapped around her like something she hadn't known she'd been missing. Winter came to Ridgecrest in November. It arrived the way Wyoming winter always did, not gradually, but all at once, chill, as if the mountains had simply decided and the valley had no vote in the matter. The first snow fell on a Tuesday, quiet and total, chill, covering the rutted road and the bare cottonwoods and the schoolhouse yard in white, so clean it looked like the world had been given a second chance. Nora stood at the schoolhouse window and watched it come down. Chill. She was aware, with the precision she brought to most things, that she was happy. Not content, not managing, happy in the uncomplicated way she had not been since before Ohio. Before the man who didn't stay, chill. Before she had learned to keep the door of herself closed for safekeeping. The supper had happened, then another, chill. Then a Sunday afternoon ride up to the ridge, with the music valley, white below them and their breath visible in the cold air, and Caleb pointing out the red-tailed hawk's empty nest in the high branches. Gone south. Chill? She'll be back in March, as if he were simply reporting facts about someone they both knew. She had started to look forward to Fridays. She had stopped pretending she didn't. In December, Mrs. Holt said, without preamble, chill, over breakfast, he's going to ask you something. Nora set down her coffee. I'm informing. The older woman refilled her own cup. He came to speak with Reverend Aldous last week. Aldous told his wife, chill, his wife told her sister. This is a small town, Nora. Nora was quiet for a moment. He's 25, she said, not as argument, almost as wonder. Yes, Mrs. Holt said, chill. And he's the steadiest man in this county at any age. And you have spent the last 6 months being careful and sensible, musing and correct. She folded her hands. How is that working for you, chill? Nora looked out the window at the snow. She thought of the empty chairs at his kitchen table. She thought of the hawk's nest in the high branches. God, she'll be back in March. Well enough, she said, chill. But she was smiling when she said it. He asked her on a Thursday evening in January, with the temperature below freezing, and the wind coming off the mountains hard enough to make the schoolhouse windows rattle. Chill? He had come to fix the window latch. It had been loose since October, and he had apparently decided that January was the appropriate moment. And she had made tea because it was cold and he was there, and there was no longer any point music, pretending that tea was not simply an excuse to extend the hour. He fixed the latch. He drank the tea. He stood with his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorframe and his hat in his hands, and looked at her with the brown eyes that had never once in 7 months looked at her with anything she needed to defend herself against. I know, she said. A pause. Mrs. Holt. God, he said. The whole town, apparently. He nodded slowly. Something in his face that was almost amusement, almost nerves. And entirely him, then I'll just ask it plainly. Please, Nora. Her name, no title for only the second time. I know who you are. I know what it cost you to walk through that kitchen door. I know you have more years and more scars and more reason for caution than I do. He held her gaze without wavering, this young man with the dark beard and the patient hands. I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to be careful with me instead of from me. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind pushed at the windows. The lamp threw its small circle of warmth. She thought of Ohio, of 11 towns, of cornbread eaten alone in 12 different rooms. She thought of the valley from the North Ridge, gold and green and endlessly wide. She looked at him. You're going to have a very stubborn wife, she said. He exhaled, slow and steady, like a man who had been holding something carefully for a very long time. Yes, ma'am, he said. I'm counting on it. He was still holding his hat. She reached music out and took it from his hands. They married in April on a Saturday when the valley had finally remembered how to be green. The church was full. Ridgecrest was a small town, and small towns show up for things that matter. And this one, it had decided, mattered. Mrs. Holt sat in the front pew and did not cry, though her handkerchief saw music considerable use. Billy Alcott sat beside her in a collar that was clearly new and clearly uncomfortable, and kept his eyes on the front of the church with the focused expression of a boy who had been told this was music important. Caleb stood at the altar in a dark coat that fit across his broad shoulders, the way a coat should fit on a man who worked his body honestly. His dark hair was combed, his beard trimmed, his brown eyes fixed on the door at the back of the church with the steady patience that was simply the way he existed in the world. The door opened. Nora walked in alone. She had no one to give her away. She had pointed this out to Reverend Aldous, who had suggested various alternatives, all of which she had declined with polite efficiency. She walked down the aisle in a dress the color of new cream. Her copper hair with its silver music at the temples pinned up, and then, because she was who she was, slightly less pinned than she'd intended, one wave loose at her jaw. She carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Mrs. Holt had pressed into her hands that morning without a word. She was 40 years old, and she was the most beautiful thing Caleb Morrow had ever seen. He said that later, that night at the kitchen table over supper, that neither of them ate much of because there was too much else to pay attention to. She told him that was a foolish thing to say. He said he'd say it anyway. She looked at him across the table, this man of 25 who had fixed her fence and brought her apples and waited without complaint and asked plainly and held the door open, God, and meant every single word he'd ever said. Outside, the Wyoming spring was arriving in its own unhurried way. Inside, for the first time in a long time, the table wasn't set for one. There's no thunder in this story, no gunfight, no villain, no burning barn. Just a woman who had learned to need nothing, and a young man patient enough to wait for her to remember that needing someone isn't music the same as being weak. Nora Quinlan drove into Ridgecrest with a trunk, a teaching certificate, and a heart she'd kept locked for 12 years. Caleb Morrow fixed fences and waited, not because he had nothing better to do, but because he had decided in a barn music at dusk with only a horse listening that she was worth it. And in April, music in a church full of people who showed up because it mattered, stubborn as a prairie root, Both of them, they found out he was right. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk through a door they've been standing outside for a very long time. Wyoming will teach you that if you let it. If this story gave you a little peace today, if you made it all the way to that church and felt something when the door opened, then you're exactly who Frontier Hearts was made for. Subscribe to the channel, leave us a like and tell us in the comments, were you rooting for them from the beginning, or did Nora take a while to win you over? There are more stories where this one came from. More wide skies, more quiet courage, more love that arrives when you've stopped looking for it. The Sign Mind Tales Studio. Until next time.